It began as a routine data sweep, one of thousands carried out by America's advanced reconnaissance satellites orbiting the Earth every day. These machines, built to monitor everything from missile launches to underground resource movements, have eyes that never blink. But in late August, as the satellite passed over the Indian subcontinent, analysts inside a quiet room at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency noticed something that didn't fit any known pattern. At first, it looked like a simple energy anomaly, faint but rhythmic pulses of heat deep below a region in central India. Then came the electromagnetic readings, strange, synchronized frequencies that didn't match any geological explanation. The system flagged it for human review, and within hours, Washington was paying attention. The early assumption was that India was testing something, perhaps a new defense system or an underground energy facility, but when image after image came through, the narrative began to shift. What they were seeing wasn't chaos or experimentation, it was structure. It was precision. It was the kind of engineering signature that suggested not just capability, but long-term planning, something years in the making. That was when the room fell silent. America wasn't looking at a random discovery. They were witnessing evidence of a hidden project so meticulously designed that it had managed to stay invisible to global intelligence networks until that moment. In the following days, classified meetings unfolded across Washington. The Pentagon wanted answers, the CIA wanted context, and the State Department wanted calm. Because if what the satellite had picked up was true, it meant that India, long seen as a technological ally but a distant competitor, had crossed into an entirely new category of strategic independence. The word terrifying began circulating in hushed tones, not because of immediate danger, but because of what it implied, a power shift. America's analysts weren't afraid of what India had built. They were afraid of what it represented. The deeper the investigation went, the stranger the data became. The underground readings pointed to an energy source of enormous magnitude, sustainable, shielded, and self-contained. The electromagnetic patterns hinted at something resembling quantum-level processing, or perhaps a new form of directed energy experimentation, but none of it matched existing Indian public research. Officially, nothing like this existed, yet the numbers said otherwise. One senior analyst reportedly remarked, "If these figures are correct, they've just rewritten the laws of energy deployment." It wasn't an exaggeration. The scale, efficiency, and concealment suggested a network operating far beyond conventional military or scientific frameworks. For decades, Washington had relied on its technological superiority to maintain global balance. Satellites, AI surveillance, and advanced energy systems were part of its unchallenged arsenal. But here, in the heart of India, was evidence of something that didn't originate in the West, a homegrown project so advanced it could redefine global strategic priorities. The shock wasn't that India was innovating. The shock was that it had done so entirely out of sight, without leaks, without international partnerships, without Western media speculation. As the intelligence reports circulated, quiet concern turned into strategic alarm. Analysts debated whether India had developed a new underground power grid or a form of quantum energy stabilizer. Some speculated it could be part of a massive subterranean data infrastructure tied to next-generation artificial intelligence programs. Others whispered about experimental defense applications, systems capable of disabling electronic signals or neutralizing attacks without open conflict. But no matter the theory, one fact remained constant: America had been caught unaware. Every frame of the satellite footage reinforced the same unsettling realization. This wasn't improvisation, it was mastery. The geometry of the heat patterns, the symmetry of the electromagnetic frequencies, even the subtle energy dispersal points suggested something deliberate, controlled, and deeply intelligent. India had built something monumental, not for show, not for deterrence, but for transformation. Behind closed doors, Washington began recalculating its understanding of India's scientific depth. For years, India's achievements in software, space exploration, and nuclear technology had been visible, celebrated, and somewhat predictable. But this was different. This was subterranean innovation, the kind that doesn't announce itself in press releases or conferences. It hinted at a nation preparing quietly for the future, while others debated it. The discovery didn't just shake Washington, it forced a rare moment of humility. For the first time in decades, American intelligence faced the realization that technological dominance was no longer guaranteed. The very satellites that symbolized that dominance had uncovered the truth that another power had learned to innovate under the radar, literally. And in doing so, India hadn't just built a facility or a system, it had built a statement, a message without words. Somewhere beneath the soil of central India, a quiet revolution was unfolding, one invisible to the naked eye, yet visible to those who watched the world from space. And as America stared at the data streaming in, one question began to echo through every corridor of power. If this is what we've just discovered, what else is still hidden? For years, the world viewed India as a nation of promise, energetic, ambitious, yet always a few steps behind the established powers of the West. But beneath the surface of that perception, something very different had been taking shape. Away from the noise of global attention and diplomatic summits, India had been quietly cultivating a force that was neither military nor purely technological, but something far deeper, self-sustaining power. A kind of silent rise that didn't rely on headlines, sanctions, or global validation. It was a rise built on endurance, vision, and the slow, deliberate layering of innovation. This hidden power didn't announce itself through nuclear tests or defense parades. It moved through laboratories, rural energy grids, and underground research zones where scientists worked without the interference of politics or publicity. What made it terrifying to observers in Washington wasn't aggression, it was invisibility. While the world debated artificial intelligence ethics, energy dependence, and space militarization, India was quietly solving problems that others were still theorizing about. The satellite discovery was only a glimpse, a tiny window into a larger ecosystem that had been evolving quietly for over a decade. The heart of this power was India's refusal to imitate. Instead of chasing Western blueprints, Indian scientists and engineers began building a new framework for innovation, one rooted in local materials, alternative energy, and homegrown computation models. In cities like Bengaluru, Hyderabad, and Pune, silent revolutions were underway. Quantum research centers without Western investors, AI neural networks trained exclusively on Indian data, and deep earth energy facilities experimenting with self-recharging magnetic cores. All of it conducted with little fanfare, deliberately kept off international radar. When American satellites caught traces of what was happening, they weren't just detecting an underground facility, they were catching a glimpse of a national philosophy, a decision to rise in silence rather than in spectacle. The Western model of progress often thrived on visibility, summits, press releases, partnerships. India's new model was different, it thrived on containment. Progress wasn't meant to be shown, it was meant to be secured. And that strategic quietness is what made it powerful. This hidden power had layers beyond technology. It was social, economic, and psychological. India had spent decades learning how to endure scarcity of resources, capital, and recognition. That endurance had forged a new kind of innovation, one that was efficient, low cost, and remarkably adaptive. Every setback became a lesson, every shortfall an experiment. By the time the world realized how far India had come, it wasn't through a public breakthrough, but a satellite, anomaly, that revealed the scale of its achievement. What truly unsettled foreign observers was how seamlessly India had integrated its spiritual resilience with scientific precision. The same philosophy that once guided its ancient civilizations now found form in micro-reactors, solar concentrators, and deep-core energy stabilizers. It wasn't just science. It was identity expressed through innovation. America, accustomed to compartmentalized development, found itself facing a civilization that saw no boundary between energy and consciousness, between discovery and destiny. That fusion, the merging of tradition and technology, was what made India's rise so difficult to predict. Inside Washington's intelligence rooms, analysts began comparing this to the early days of the US nuclear project, a quiet but unstoppable accumulation of knowledge and infrastructure. Yet the difference was striking. Where America's rise had depended on secrecy born from fear, India's silence was born from patience. It didn't seek dominance, it sought liberation. liberation from dependence on imported energy, imported software, and imported validation. In its quiet ascent, India was building not just machines, but sovereignty. The satellite footage became more than just an intelligence file. It became a symbol of the new century's shifting power. It reminded the West that empires are not always overthrown by confrontation. Sometimes they are outgrown through quiet mastery. A hidden power had been rising all along, nurtured not in boardrooms or battlefields, but in the calm persistence of minds that refused to give up. India's rise in silence was not the absence of ambition, it was strategy. While others broadcasted every success, India understood that real transformation doesn't need to be seen to be real, it only needs to work. And as the quiet hum of energy beneath its soil began to pulse louder in the sensors of American satellites, one thing became unmistakably clear. A new kind of power had emerged, one that didn't roar or threaten but simply existed, unshakable, undeniable, and entirely self-made. When the first satellite images began streaming into the National Reconnaissance Center, the data looked unremarkable, a cluster of faint circular patterns beneath a sparsely populated region of central India. At first glance, analysts assumed it was an agricultural project or underground water mapping system. But then the thermal overlays were added, and everything changed. The temperature readings didn't align with anything naturally occurring. They followed a pattern, geometric, pulsing in perfect rhythm, and stretching across several kilometers underground. That kind of precision could not be random. The algorithms flagged it immediately, and what began as a routine scan soon escalated into a classified investigation. As more imagery poured in, the details grew sharper. The heat signatures formed what appeared to be a network, interconnected nodes radiating energy toward a centralized core. The electromagnetic data was even stranger. It showed alternating bursts of frequency structured in mathematical ratios. To the trained eye, this wasn't geological activity, it was coordination, a controlled pulse, moving through layers of rock and soil as if the earth itself had become part of a machine. When analysts cross-referenced these findings with satellite archives from previous years, they noticed something astonishing. The formation had been expanding gradually, almost imperceptibly, over time. Whatever India was building, it wasn't new. It had been evolving quietly for at least a decade. The closer the resolution became, the more questions arose. There were faint indications of metallic conduits or shielded structures buried far below the surface, beyond what normal mining or construction equipment could manage. The symmetry was remarkable. Every line, every junction seemed designed with mathematical precision. The depth of some of these installations exceeded 2 kilometers, a feat nearly impossible without highly specialized boring technology. Washington's engineers studied the topography and concluded that the project required both vast resources and an extraordinary understanding of subsurface energy flow. That alone was enough to send shockwaves through the intelligence community. But what truly unsettled the analysts wasn't the engineering, it was the energy. Instruments detected electromagnetic frequencies that didn't match known power systems. They weren't consistent with nuclear, solar, or geothermal sources. Instead, the readings hinted at something hybrid, possibly a form of zero-point or quantum energy stabilization. It was speculative, even fantastical, but the data didn't lie. The field strength was immense, yet it emitted no radiation, no surface heat, no pollution. It was pure, stable, and silent. America's own energy physicists were brought in for analysis, and even they couldn't decode the frequency structure completely. One described it as a symphony without a composer, a perfect balance of energy oscillation maintained without visible input. Attempts to correlate the imagery with India's public energy projects yielded nothing. No known facility, no press release, no budget allocation matched what the satellites were seeing. The discovery appeared to exist entirely off the grid, financed, constructed, and operated in secrecy. There were no signs of heavy surface disturbance or industrial traffic, which meant the equipment and personnel involved had been moved underground or disguised as civilian infrastructure. That level of concealment indicated not just scientific brilliance, but strategic discipline. It was a reminder that true innovation doesn't always leave a footprint. As analysts layered more data, something remarkable emerged. The formation's layout resembled a mandala, intricate, symmetrical, and centered on a precise focal point. The resemblance was so uncanny that one cultural intelligence officer suggested the design might have philosophical roots, merging spiritual geometry with engineering logic. It wasn't just a system, it was a statement. The fusion of technology and tradition. The deeper they analyzed it, the clearer it became that this wasn't an ordinary power grid or defense installation. It was something holistic, a structure designed to harness energy in ways that echoed both ancient principles and cutting-edge science. By the third week of analysis, Washington had to accept an uncomfortable reality. Whatever India had created, it was operating successfully. There were no signs of instability or malfunction. In fact, the readings suggested near-perfect energy efficiency, a network capable of sustaining itself without external dependency. The data scientists couldn't decide which was more alarming, the fact that it worked or the fact that they had no idea how. Every attempt to decode the signal patterns led to more mystery. The frequencies appeared adaptive, self-correcting, even intelligent. It was as though the system could anticipate fluctuations and rebalance itself. That hinted at an AI-driven infrastructure far beyond what the West had publicly achieved. And yet, no digital trace pointed to a centralized control center. Everything seemed decentralized, self-governing, synchronized through invisible logic. In the dimly lit operations rooms, analysts replayed the data over and over, trying to find flaws, cracks, anything that could reduce the gravity of what they were witnessing. But every scan, every test, every new layer of imagery only reinforced one truth. This was deliberate, controlled, and years ahead of its time. The satellite images had exposed not just a hidden structure beneath Indian soil, but a paradigm shift in how nations could command energy, technology, and strategy, not through warfare or display, but through quiet, invisible mastery. For decades, the global narrative around power has revolved around visible symbols: aircraft carriers, nuclear arsenals, military alliances, and international sanctions. Yet, in the 21st century, the meaning of dominance has shifted. It's no longer about who commands the loudest presence, but who can sustain the deepest independence. That is where India's transformation began, not as a reaction to Western hegemony, but as a quiet assertion of self-reliance. The satellite discovery merely revealed the physical evidence of something that had already taken root in the national psyche: India's entry into a new age of strategic dominance. This dominance is unlike any before it because it is not territorial, aggressive, or ideological. It is infrastructural, intellectual, and psychological. India understood something the world had long overlooked: that true power in the modern era lies in control over technology, energy, and information, not in their possession, but in their creation. By building systems that the rest of the world depends on, yet cannot replicate or disrupt, India was rewriting the blueprint of influence. The underground network detected by American satellites symbolized more than a scientific breakthrough. It represented a civilization claiming autonomy over its own destiny. At the center of this dominance lies the idea of strategic invisibility. While traditional powers flaunt their capabilities to assert deterrence, India has chosen a different path: to evolve beneath the radar, to build without boasting, to prepare without provoking. This quiet accumulation of capability has become its greatest strength. Every innovation, from satellite technology to quantum communication and indigenous energy grids, has been layered into a national framework that prioritizes function over fame. By the time other nations notice, India's foundations are already unshakable. The economic implications of this shift are profound. Energy independence, particularly through unconventional systems like the one detected underground, means liberation from global fuel markets and trade dependencies that have long been used as instruments of control. Technological sovereignty, powered by indigenous computing and artificial intelligence systems, means no longer relying on foreign software ecosystems. Together, these shifts create an unspoken leverage, a position where India cannot easily be pressured, sanctioned, or isolated. It's the quiet transformation from being a participant in the global system to being an architect of it. Strategic dominance also comes from patience. a virtue deeply embedded in India's cultural and political fabric. While other nations chase immediate superiority, India has built its progress like an ancient structure, layer by layer, decade by decade. This patience has allowed it to avoid the volatility that plagues more impulsive powers. It invests long, observes longer, and acts only when the foundations are ready. What the West perceives as slowness is, in reality, precision, and that precision is beginning to yield results that are no longer possible to ignore. The satellite data, in Washington's eyes, may have seemed like an isolated project, but to those who study India's broader trajectory, it fits into a clear continuum. From space exploration milestones like Chandrayaan and Aditya to defense independence under Make in India, and digital revolutions such as the Aadhaar and UPI systems that redefined how billions interact with technology. Each initiative was a piece of a larger puzzle, one aimed at securing not just technological supremacy but resilience against external interference. India wasn't racing against the West, it was insulating itself from it. Equally crucial is the psychological dimension of this new age. India's rise has dismantled the old narrative of dependence. The idea that developing nations must align with superpowers to progress. For the first time, it stands as proof that a country can be both democratic and defiant, rooted in tradition yet futuristic in execution. That psychological shift from compliance to confidence is perhaps the most significant form of dominance. It sends a subtle message to the world: India will cooperate, but never conform. Geopolitically, this transformation has ripple effects that stretch across continents. Regional powers now look to India not just as an ally, but as an alternative, a stabilizing force in a world of polarized blocs. Its ability to engage with both the East and the West without being consumed by either has made it a diplomatic anomaly, unpredictable, yet indispensable. And as America's satellite data hinted, the infrastructure of this influence is not built on ideology or aggression, but on silent, systematic control over the levers of modern civilization, data, energy, and innovation. In essence, India's new age of strategic dominance is not about conquering others, it is about mastering itself. It is the culmination of decades of quiet resilience, scientific ingenuity, and cultural unity, converging into one undeniable truth. That power, when rooted in self-sufficiency and vision, no longer needs validation from anyone. It simply exists, steady as the hum beneath its soil, radiating outward in silence. A signal not of fear, but of inevitability. For years, the global order appeared stable, at least on the surface. The West led through institutions, technology, and financial systems, while emerging economies played their expected roles within that structure. Power was predictable, influence was measurable, and control was centralized. Yet, beneath that neatly arranged hierarchy, something profound was shifting. Slowly, silently, and almost invisibly. The discovery made by the American satellite was not just about India's hidden innovation. It was a revelation that the world's axis of power had already begun to tilt. The global shift nobody saw coming wasn't a political revolution or a war. It was a redefinition of progress itself, led by nations that had long been underestimated. For decades, the United States and its allies operated under the belief that dominance came from visibility, from projecting strength through fleets, financial markets, and technology patents. But India's silent transformation challenged that doctrine. It proved that power could be built not through spectacle, but through subtlety. While global attention was fixed on the visible contest between America and China, India had chosen a different lane altogether, one that didn't compete for headlines but quietly rewrote the terms of global relevance. By the time the West realized it, the balance had already changed. This shift was rooted in something far more enduring than geopolitical maneuvering. It was philosophical. The Western world, driven by immediacy and profit, thrived on disruption. India thrived on continuity. Where others pursued dominance, India pursued equilibrium. This philosophical contrast had been misunderstood for years as a sign of passivity, but in reality, it was the foundation of resilience. The result was an ecosystem that could grow under pressure, innovate under scarcity, and thrive without dependence. The world mistook calm for weakness, and that misjudgment allowed India the freedom to evolve without interference. The implications of this new paradigm stretch far beyond technology. Economically, it marks the emergence of a multipolar system in which no single nation can dictate terms. India's emphasis on self-reliant energy systems, indigenous AI, and decentralized trade networks undermines the traditional levers of Western control: currency dominance, intellectual property monopolies, and export dependencies. Politically, it signals a new kind of leadership, one that doesn't seek to replace the old order, but to transcend it. India's quiet assertion of autonomy is reshaping how nations think about alliances. No longer are countries asking, whose side are we on, but rather, how do we stand on our own? The cultural dimensions of this shift are equally powerful. For centuries, the narrative of modernity was written in Western vocabulary, progress equated with imitation of the West. But India has inverted that narrative. Its rise is anchored in reclaiming its civilizational identity, proving that ancient philosophies can coexist with futuristic science. It has shown that technology need not erase tradition, it can amplify it. This synthesis of old and new, of spiritual and scientific, gives India a moral gravity that purely material superpowers lack. It projects stability not through force, but through example. That is why its influence resonates far beyond borders, not as domination, but as inspiration. The psychological impact of this discovery within global corridors of power has been profound. The idea that a developing nation could independently engineer technologies rivaling, or surpassing, those of established superpowers disrupts centuries of hierarchy. It erases the old assumption that progress must flow from west to east. Instead, the current now runs both ways, and increasingly from south to north. It is not merely a transfer of innovation, but a transfer of confidence. The same countries once labeled as emerging markets are now emerging as intellectual powers. The satellite discovery was symbolic of something larger, the end of predictability. The intelligence community had long relied on models that assumed transparency, that every major power would display its capabilities through test launches, infrastructure, or digital footprints. India broke that model. Its strategy of silent advancement exposed a blind spot in the world's understanding of power. It reminded everyone that the greatest revolutions often happen quietly, in labs, in classrooms, in deep earth facilities, far from the noise of political theatre. For the United States and its allies, this shift has triggered a re-evaluation of strategy. They now face a world where dominance cannot be measured by military bases or GDP alone. Influence is no longer about control, but credibility. And India, with its blend of technological strength, moral independence, and cultural continuity, has become a new kind of superpower, one that commands without conquering. It leads not by demanding allegiance, but by demonstrating possibility. The global shift nobody saw coming was, in truth, the result of everyone looking in the wrong direction. While the world watched the loudest competitors, the quietest contender changed the rules. The satellites may have been the first to notice India's underground innovation, but the real revelation was much larger, that the 21st century will belong not to those who dominate the world's systems, but to those who can create new ones from within. And as those hidden networks hum beneath Indian soil, the world is beginning to understand that silence, in the right hands, can be the most powerful sound of all.